In this one, we'll cover the basics of state machine and how to set up simple interactions using state machine inputs, blend 1D states, and set up listeners for hovers, clicks, and pointer move. Use the video chapters to navigate the lessons and also download the Rive backup files from the description below to follow along. With that, let's get started. Just like animations, to work with state machines, we need to switch over to the animate mode. And by default, in a file, you will find a state machine and a timeline. But of course, you can come to the animations panel and at any time, you can add a state machine. Depending upon what's selected from the animations panel, the right panel will change as well. If we select a timeline, we will have the timeline view. If we select state machine, we will have the state machines interface. Let's go ahead and overview the different panels of the state machine, starting with the inputs panel. Here we can add inputs using which we can control the state transitions. We have the listeners panel from where we can set up listeners for different mouse events. And then we have the state machine layer. We can play and pause the state machine, set the zoom level. We can give the state machine layer a name as well by double clicking on the same. And then inside of the state machine, we have the different states, these boxes with labels. By default, we have the entry state, the any state, and the exit state. You can click and drag any state like this, that is the boxes. And if you want, you can use the same shortcuts to navigate around the state machine layer as we have done in the design stage. You can right click and move around to pan the state machine layer. You can hold down Control or Command and scroll to change the zoom level of the state machine layer as well. Apart from the three default states, you can drag your timelines as well into the state machine by clicking and dragging the timelines into the state machine and set up interactions with the same. Next, we have the console, from where we can view the log messages and keep track of things happening in the state machine. And then we have the right panel. Depending upon what's selected, will have its properties like this, kind of like the inspector we have in the design mode. And that's a basic overview of the state machine's interface. In the next one, let's go ahead and set up a basic interaction with our press animation. In the previous one, we've gone over the state machine's interface. In this one, we will learn how to set up a basic interaction with state transitions. By default, in a state machine layer, you will find these three states: the entry state, any state, and the exit state. When you start the state machine, entry is active. This is the entry point to the state machine as well. If you want any other state to be active or be played at the start of the state machine, you can perform a transition from the entry state to that state. Then we have the any state, which can be used to perform the same transition but any time of the state machine or from any state as well. Finally, you have the exit state, well, which can be used to exit out of the state machine if you transition to the exit state. And of course, you can drag in your timelines into the state machine as well, like we have done before. As mentioned before, entry is active at the start of our state machine. If we want any other state to be active, say play the press animation, then I can perform a transition from the entry state to the press state. Before creating the transition, let's go ahead and rearrange the states. I can click and drag the states like this. And then to create a transition, I can hover over any state. A dot appears. You can click and drag to get a line and then connect with the state and create the transition in between. Right now, if we play the state machine, it will enter and then go to the press state and play the animation. So if I go ahead and start the state machine, it will go from entry to press and play the animation. For a split second, you will notice entry is active and then press is activated and played as well. If I go back to the press timeline, play the animation, and then if I go back to the state machine and play it as well, we have the same thing, that is, we're simply playing the animation. Instead, if you want to control when the press happens, that is the playback of the animation, we can set up a condition for the transition. That is, when should the transition happen from entry to press. For that, first of all, we need an input to control the playback, the transition. From the inputs panel, we can add a new input. We can use a number input, a Boolean input, or trigger. Let's go with trigger. It's a simple input which we can trigger and control transitions. I can select the transition, that is arrow, and edit its properties, that is conditions, from the below panel. So if I select the transition, that appears. Instead, if you want this panel to be sticked to the view, you can click on the pin icon, and now that will stay in the place. If you want to resize the panel, you can click on the resize icon and then resize it like this. Let's go ahead and select the transition from entry to press, and then click on the plus icon to create a condition. So if something happens, only then we transition to the press state and play the animation. And that will be our input. I can select that from the dropdown, that is the trigger one. You have the artboard's width and height as well, using which you can create conditions. In this case, we want to select our trigger. Now, what will happen is if the trigger is triggered, only then we go to the press state, that is perform the transition and play the animation along with the same. If I play the state machine, notice the blue outline is around the entry state. So it's waiting for the input to be triggered to perform the transition as well. So if I go ahead and trigger the input, it goes to the press state and plays the animation as well. And that's how we create transitions in Rive. The idea stays the same. You have different states, transitions in between, controlled by different inputs, that is conditions. And that's how we set up a basic transition in State Machine. In the previous one, we have learned how to set up state transitions and control them with inputs and conditions. If I go ahead and start the State Machine, it will wait for the input to be triggered before transitioning over to the press state as we have specified in the condition. If I go ahead and trigger the input, it will perform the transition and go to the press state and play the animation as well. What if we trigger the input again? Well, nothing happens because we have specified the transition from entry to press. That happens, then press becomes active, and after that, we don't have any transition from press, say, to itself, and that we cannot as well. If you want to play the press animation whenever the input is triggered, then we need this transition from entry or any other state to press whenever the input is triggered. And to do that, right now, we cannot go back to the entry state from press because entry is a special state that can only be used once at the start when we play the state machine. Instead, we can create another state, another timeline that will be active when the press animation is not playing. Let's go ahead and create a new timeline. I can give it a name. Let's say idle. And in fact, we can use this empty timeline to be active when the press animation is not playing. But it is recommended to have the default state of the animation. In this case, the upper position of the rectangle. I can copy the keyframe and paste it into the idle timeline. And then I can even change the timeline duration to just 1 frame because all it has is just 1 keyframe as well. And that will be more than enough as a placeholder for the idle state in the state machine. I can remove the transition in between entry and press and then add the idle timeline in between. First of all, I can perform a transition from entry to idle. That will be the default one, active when we start this state machine. And then I can add a transition between idle and press like this. If we don't add any condition for the transitions, it will go straight to the press state and play the press animation because there is no condition for the transitions, so that will happen. Instead, I want to wait for the input to be triggered and play the press animation. So I can select the transition in between idle and press and add the same condition as before. If the input is triggered, we play the animation. So if I trigger the input, only then the press animation is played. Now, to play the animation, whenever the input is triggered, we need to go back to the idle state as well and perform the same thing, that is from idle to press when the input is triggered. To do that, I can simply hover over the press and create the transition from press to idle like this. Now, if I go ahead and start the state machine and press the trigger input, well, nothing happens. Now is a good time to check the console for events happening behind the scenes in the state machine. I can restart the state machine. So first of all, it goes from entry to idle and then plays the idle animation as well. That is the timeline, even though it only has one frame. And then if we trigger the input, it triggers that. We have the log message. Then it transitions from idle to press. And because there is no condition stopping the transition from press to idle, that happens as well, just like we have seen before. Instead, what we want here is the press animation to play at all and then go back to the idle state. To do that, we can select the transition and from the transition properties, add exit time. That is, I can enable exit time and add the time that it should wait before exiting, that is transitioning. In this case, I can set that as the timeline duration for the press animation, or I can use percent values, that is 100%. And then if I go ahead and change the timeline duration of the press animation, I won't have to come back and change that in the transition properties and the exit time. So let's go ahead and test the same out. I can play the state machine. I can trigger the input. It plays out the press animation and then goes back to the idle state. That is, waits 100% of the press timeline's duration. And if I trigger the input again, the press animation plays again and again as well. So that's how we set up interactions with state machine in Rive. This video is a preview of the full Rive animation course. If you want to learn and master Rive, check out the full course where we'll cover everything from scratch, the designer and tools, animations, state machine, of course, as well as data binding. Check out the course now and use the coupon code YDMagic20 to get an extra 20% off. Link to the same will be given in the description below. With that, let's get back to the video. In the previous section, we learned how to set up basic interactions in state machine. In this one, we'll cover the different state machine inputs. We already covered the trigger input. Let's go over it again. Here, I have the cannon fire animation, which we created before. Let's go ahead and set up a basic interaction to control the cannon fire with the trigger of an input. I can go ahead and first of all, add a new state machine and then drag and drop the cannon fire timeline into the state machine layer and then create a transition from entry to cannon fire. And then to control the transition in between, I can add the trigger input, give it a name, and then use it as the condition for the transition. So to transition to the cannon fire state, we need the input to be triggered. I can play the state machine and test the same. To play the animation, every time we trigger the input, we need an idle state in between and have that active when the animation is not playing. To do that, I can add a new timeline. I can call it idle. And then if we want, we can copy the default state of the cannon fire, that is the starting keyframes, or I can leave the idle timeline empty as well. It will work. So I can go ahead and remove the transition in between entry and cannon fire, add idle in between, and then transition from entry to idle. So that will be the active state by default. And then from idle to cannon fire on a condition, that is if the input is triggered, we perform the transition to cannon fire like this. Then to perform the same thing again, we need to go back to the idle state. To do that, I can create a transition from Canon Fire to idle. And then to make sure Canon Fire is played at all the animation, I can make use of exit time. I can enable exit time for the transition and set that to 100%. So before exiting, transitioning to the idle state, Canon Fire will play 100%, that is at all. Now I can go ahead and test the state machine. If I trigger the input, we perform the Canon Fire. If I trigger it again, it triggers the Canon Fire again and again like this. We can achieve the same thing with the any state as well. That is, instead of entry state, which can only be used at the start when we play the state machine, we can use any state, which can be used, well, anytime and from any state. So I can go ahead and remove the setup we have right now and use any state instead of entry. So first of all, I can perform a transition from any state to Canon Fire, and that will be capturing the entry point as well. So I can set up the condition. If the input is triggered, we play the Canon Fire animation, and then I can go to the idle just like before. That is from the Canon Fire to idle after making sure the Canon Fire animation is played 100%. I can enable exit time and make sure it is played 100% before exiting, transitioning in this case. And then I can go ahead and play the state machine and get the same effect as before. So if I go ahead and trigger the input, first of all, it animates to the Canon Fire like this and then goes to idle. And then if I trigger the input again, because we have any state to Canon Fire transition and any state captures any state, including idle, it will work as well like this. So that's how we can use the any state and the trigger input in state machines. In this one, we will learn about the Boolean input, which can be set to true or false, that is checked or unchecked. Using the Boolean value, we can create conditions and transition between two states. Here, I have the menu icon, which we have animated before, of the arrow becoming menu and the menu becoming arrow as well. We can use them in the state machine and use the Boolean value to switch between the arrow and the menu icon. First of all, I can go ahead and enter into the menu state, that is play the menu animation, and then I can go to the arrow if the Boolean input is checked. I can rename the Boolean input as well, say to is arrow. If is arrow is checked, we can transition to the arrow state and play the animation as well. So I can go ahead and create a transition from menu to arrow and then create a condition. I can pin the condition panel as well. Add a condition. If the is arrow Boolean input is set to true, we perform the transition. And because is arrow is a Boolean input, we get the value selection as well to make the condition. In this case, if is arrow is set to true, we perform the transition and play the animation as well. That is the menu becoming arrow. Right now, menu is active. If I go ahead and check the Boolean input, it will go to the arrow state and perform the transition as well. Similarly, if I uncheck the Boolean input, it should go back to the menu state. To do that, I can create another transition from arrow to menu like this. And if you have not already guessed, we can add a condition. If the is arrow is set to false, we can perform the transition back from arrow to menu like this. So if I go ahead and check the Boolean input, arrow is active. If I uncheck the Boolean input, it goes back to menu, and we can switch between the menu and arrow using the Boolean input like this. One thing to note right now is if I go ahead and start the state machine, by default, the menu animation plays, that is this right here. If you want to avoid that, that is when we start the animation or the state machine, it should be static, the menu icon. To do that, I can create a default idle state at the start. For that, I can duplicate the menu icon, call it default, and then copy or keep the keyframe for the menu icon like this and change the timeline duration to just a frame because that's what we have. and then I can use it in our state machine. So first of all, we enter the default state by default, and then from there, I can go to arrow if arrow is checked, because the default state is holding the keyframe for the menu icon. That's what we have. So I can change the positions like this, and then perform a transition from default to arrow if the condition is arrow set to true. Now, if I go ahead and start the state machine, we have no animation at the start, the static menu icon, and then if I check the Boolean input, it performs the transition and plays the arrow animation. If I uncheck it, it goes to menu, and then it performs the back and forth in between arrow and menu like this. Another thing to note here is by default, our menu icon looks like a menu as well. So we can remove the default state altogether in between and then perform the transition, the same condition as before. That is, if our input is set to true, is arrow, then we perform the transition, and by default, there is no animation, the static menu icon. It is recommended to use the default states with the keyframes. So even if you change something in the design mode, it does not affect your state machine. And that's how we use the Boolean input to switch between two different states like this. Here I have a similar setup like before. That is, I have transition setup between menu and arrow state, and that is controlled by the Boolean input. If I check it, it goes to the arrow state. If I uncheck it, it goes to the menu state, that is, plays the animations. I can take a look at the timelines as well, where we have interpolation between two keyframes, that is the arrow and the menu state like this. We have keyed in the rotation of the group and the position of the vertices, which we have looked at before. And to get the other animation, I've literally duplicated the above and reversed the position of the keyframes. Now, instead of performing the interpolation in the timelines, all we have is two set of keyframes. We can just key in the final state of the animation, say the menu and the arrow, and perform the interpolation in the state machine, that is the transitions. So I can go ahead and remove the extra keyframe, only keep the keyframe for the arrow state, the position of the vertices, and the rotation of the group, and even change the timeline's duration to just a frame, because that's what we want. We just want the keyframe as the state. I can do that for the menu timeline as well. And then if I take a look at the state machine and change the input, we have a static switch between the two icons, the two states like this. Now to animate the vertices, that is, add some interpolation between the two states, I can select the transition, say from menu to arrow, and then from the right panel, that is the transition properties, I can add some transition duration. Right now it is set to 0 milliseconds, that is no interpolation, no animation. That's why we have the static change. Instead, I can increase that to a value, say 100 or 1000 milliseconds, that is equivalent to a second. Now, if I go ahead and perform the same thing, notice we have an interpolation between the menu and the arrow icon. If I want, I can change the curve as well. By default, it uses the linear curve. Well, you can change that to cubic or even elastic as well. So if I perform the same thing, change is arrow to true, it will perform the interpolation with a custom curve and transition duration, which you can define in the transition properties. I can do the same thing for the transition from arrow to menu as well. Select the transition, add the transition duration, say a second, and then change the interpolation curve as well. And you have the animation in between the states like this. Instead of creating the animations in the timeline, you can just key in the relevant properties in the timeline, and in the state machine, you can define the interpolation curve, the time, and get the animation in between the states like this. Let's go ahead and look at another example. Let's say we want to control which side is heavier for the weight scale, left or the right. To do that, I can use a Boolean input. So first of all, we can go ahead and simply key in the different sides. I can go ahead and create a timeline, say left, and then rotate the weight scale to the left as well, as if the left side is heavier. I can change the timeline duration to just a frame as well, because we only have one keyframe, the rotation of the target. And then I can create another timeline, call it right, and change the rotation to the right side like this. Now I can go ahead and set up the transitions in the state machine. By default, left will be active, then we can transition to right and back to left as well. I can go ahead and add a Boolean to control the transition in between. Let's say is right heavy or something, and then I can go ahead and set up the transitions. That is, I can pin the panel, select the states, zoom them into the view, and then select the transition from left to right, add the condition, that is, the input should be set to true, and then it should go back from right to left if the input is set to false. I can test that as well. Right now, we don't have any animation, any interpolation between the transitions. Instead, I can select the transitions, add a transition duration, say a second, change the curve as well. And then if I go ahead and change the input, we have the interpolation like this. That's how we can simply key in the keyframes, the position, the states of the animations, and perform the transitions, the animations in the state machine using the transition properties like this. Make sure you download the file given below with animations for which you have to set up interactions using a Boolean input. In this one, we will learn about the number input. We can set the number input's value to any numeric value and use that as conditions in between state transitions. For demonstration, I've created some step animations, that is step 1, then step 2. It will pick up from where the previous step left off. That's why the start of step 2 and the end of step 1 will look the same. That's something you can take a note of. If I play the animation, we have step 2. If I play step 3, well, we have step 3 as well. Big surprise. I can go ahead and set up the interaction using the number input. That is, I can rename the number input to be step and increase the number input's value to perform the animations one by one. So first of all, I can go ahead and transition to the start state, that is the step 0. So I can drag that in to the state machine layer and have that active at the start when I play the state machine. And then I can perform a transition to step 1 with a condition, that is the number input should be set to 1. You can perform many comparisons with different numbers. That is, you can make sure it is equal to a value. You can make sure it is not equal to a value. You can make sure it is greater than, less than a value, and so on. In this case, we want to perform equality comparison. That is, the number input's value should be equal to 1. And then I can perform the transition. If I go ahead and play the state machine, start will be active at the start. Well, and then I can increase the number input to 1 and it will perform the transition. Similarly, we can perform the transition to step 2 as well. I can create the transition, add a condition, the number input should be equal to 2, and then I can go ahead and add the step 3 as well at the same time, and then set up the condition from step 2 to step 3. If the number input is equal to 3, we perform the transition. Let's go ahead and test that out. By default, start is active. I can increase the step number input. It will go to step 1, step 2, and then step 3 like this. Using the Boolean input, we can switch between two states, but if we want to switch between multiple states, we can use the number input. That is, I have keyed in the different states of the icon like this. To switch between these icons, I can set up transitions using the number input, that is different number values for different icons. Say menu will be 0 or 1, cross will be 2, arrow right will be 3, arrow left will be 4, the number input's value. So I can add a number input, change its name, say to icon, and instead of using entry for the transitions, because it can happen from any state, that is, I can transition from menu to arrow, arrow to cross, cross to arrow left, and so on, we will set up the transitions with the any state. So I can move these two out of the view, and then I can set up the transitions. First of all, I can get every timeline into the state machine layer. I can arrange the states as well, and then set up the transitions. And when I do that, I can set up the conditions as well. To use the number input for all the 4 transitions, I can select all of them, add a condition, and select the number input like this. And then one by one, I can change the value for the condition. So we transition to the menu icon if the number input is set to 1. We transition to the cross if the value is set to 2. We transition to the arrow right if the value is set to 3. We transition to the arrow left if the value is set to 4. Now I can go ahead and by default set a value before playing the state machine, say to 1. So that will be the default state. I can play the state machine, and that is activated by default. If I change the value, say to 2, it transitions over to the cross icon. If I change it to 3, it transitions over to the arrow right. Now to get some animation, some interpolation in between, I can again select all 4 of the transitions, and from the transition properties, I can change the duration, say to 500 milliseconds, and add interpolation as well instead of the linear interpolation. Now, if I go ahead and change the value, we have the interpolation of the icons, that is the animation. And if I want, as I mentioned before, I can switch from menu, say to arrow left by changing the value to 4, and we have the same. I can change it to say 2 and animate from arrow left to cross, from cross to arrow right, and get the interpolation like this. If you want, you can actually set up the same thing with triggers as well. Instead of number input, you can create different trigger inputs for different icons and use them in conditions. Either you create multiple named trigger inputs for each state, or create one number input and map arbitrary number values to different states. For an exercise, go ahead and set up a state machine using number input to morph a shape from triangle to rectangle and an ellipse or any other shape if you want. A hint, you can convert an ellipse first of all to a custom shape and then key in its vertices for the different states. That's how we use the number input in state machines. In this one, we'll set up interactions for the location pin icon. If searching for a location, we can play the looping animation. When a location is found, we can stop the looping animation and play the pin jump animation as an indication. To control the animation, that is the transitions, we can use a Boolean input. If it is set to false, it will be in the idle state. If it is set to true, that is searching for a location, we can play the looping animation. So first of all, let's go ahead and create the idle state. That will be the starting keyframes of the looping animation, the default state. I can change the timeline duration to just 1 frame and the playback mode to 1 shot. Then I can add a state machine and set up the transitions between idle and rotate. To control the transitions, we need a Boolean input. I can add 1 and give it a name, say searching, and then set up the transitions and use the Boolean input as a condition. First of all, I can add a transition from entry to idle, and then I can add another transition from idle to rotate. If the Boolean input is set to true, I can resize the panel, pin it, and then add a condition from idle to rotate if our Boolean input is set to true. I can go back to the idle state as well if the Boolean input is set to false. Let's go ahead and test the same. I can check the Boolean input, it will play the looping animation. If I uncheck the Boolean input, it will go back to the idle state. Right now, it does that with a jump. That is, there is no transition from rotate to idle because we stop the animation midway, that is, perform the transition. Instead, we can add some transition duration because we have keyframes in the idle state. So I can select the transition from rotate to idle, add some transition duration, say 500 milliseconds, change the curve, and then if I test it out, I can go to the looping animation. Then if we go back to idle, we have the interpolation. Right now, it actually goes back because of how the keyframes are set up. These are the starting keyframes, so it will go back. And if we try that at different times, we'll have different behaviors. Instead, what we want is the animation to complete one loop. That is, say if we change the input midway, the animation is playing, it can complete one complete loop and then go to the idle state. To do that, we can actually use the exit time. That is, I can remove the transition duration and then instead enable exit time and set that to 100%. That is, we can give the rotate timeline 100% of its timeline duration to complete before exiting and transitioning to the idle state. That is, I can play the animation. If I set searching to true, it will play the rotating animation. And then if I uncheck it, it will finish one loop and then go back to idle. To notice that better, I can select the rotate timeline, the rotate state, and change its speed. And yes, we can do that in state machine as well. I can set it to 0.25. And then if I perform the same thing, check the Boolean input, it will perform the looping animation. Notice we have the progress as well in the state. And then if I uncheck it, it will finish one loop and then go back to the idle state. So that's how you can use the exit time to make sure animations finish before exiting, that is transitioning to another state. I will reset the animation speed. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and add the pin jump animation to the transitions as well. That is, when the animation finishes, that is our looping animation, we can add the pin jump. So instead of going from rotate to idle directly, we can add the pin jump in between. So I can add that from rotate to pin jump if the input is set to false. And the same thing as before, I can utilize exit time and make sure the loop completes one complete loop, the animation. And then from pin jump, we can go to idle well after playing the whole animation. Again, utilizing exit time, setting that to 100%. Now I can go ahead and reposition the states as well. And then I can go ahead and test it out. If I check the Boolean input, it goes to rotate, plays the looping animation. If I uncheck it, it goes to pin jump after finishing one loop, and then we have the same. We have achieved the interaction we wanted. If I set the Boolean input to true, it plays the rotate animation. If I set it to false, it plays the pin jump animation after completing one loop. Right now, the animations happen one after the other. That is, we wait for the rotate to finish before playing the pin jump animation. Instead, if you want the pin jump animation to play at the very same time, we set the value to false. Then we need to remove the exit time. If we remove the exit time, then we won't have the transition, that is, the loop won't complete, and we'll have the jump from loop to the idle state. So what we want right now is the loop to complete as well as the pin jump animation to play at the very same time. We set the input to false. To do that, we need to have the two states active at the same time. But we have learned before, in a state machine layer, only one state can be active at a given time. So instead, we can add another state machine layer. If you want two states to be active at a given time, then you can add another state machine layer. In this case, we have the layer 1. I can add another one by clicking on the plus icon and set up the transitions as we have done before. So I can set up another layer for the pin jump animation or the pin jump interaction. So I can remove it from the first state and set up the transitions we had before. From rotate, we can go back to idle after making sure one loop is completed, and the condition for that will be the searching input should be set to false. I can change the name of the layer as well, say the looping animation, and then I can create a pin idle timeline as well by duplicating the pin jump, changing its name. And then I can remove the extra keyframes, only keep the starting ones, and then change the timeline duration to just a frame. Then in the layer 2, I can set up the transitions from pin idle to pin jump using the Boolean input. For the control, from entry, we can go to pin idle by default, and then from pin idle, we can go to pin jump if the searching Boolean input is set to false. And we can go back to pin idle as well if the Boolean input is set to true. That is the reverse of what we had with the looping animation. I can give this layer a name as well, the pin jump. Then I can go ahead and play the state machine. And by default, pin jump plays. We'll address that. But for now, if I go ahead and check the input, it plays the looping animation. And if I uncheck it, it completes the loop as well as performs the pin jump. That is at the very same time. I can do that again. If I uncheck the Boolean input, it stops the looping animation as well as performs the pin jump. So we can have two states active at the same time in different layers like this. Now let's go ahead and address the issue. That is, if I start the state machine, it starts the pin jump. I can simply add a condition from entry to pin idle. That is, the searching should be set to true to perform the transition from entry to pin idle, and then to pin jump, I can restart the state machine, and we don't have the pin jump animation like before. Now it's waiting for the Boolean input to be set to true. So it goes to pin idle. From there, if I uncheck the Boolean input, it goes to pin jump and plays the animation as well. And that's how we utilize different state machine layers in state machines. In this one, we will learn how to use blend states to control the interpolation between two states with a number input. Like we can control the trim end of the stroke. That is, we can create a blend between the start and the end of the stroke and control that with a number input in the state machine. To do that, first of all, we need the two states, that is the start and the end. I can create a duplicate of this timeline, name it end, and keep the ending keyframe as well, the 100% value for trim end, change the timeline duration to 1, and create the starting state as well. That will be the start keyframe. Instead of starting from 0%, that is the stroke appearing from nowhere when the value increases, instead, I can start from 0.1%. So we have something visible at the start. Then we can increase the stroke like this. It is not required for the blend state to work, but something you can add. I can remove the ending keyframe and set the timeline duration to just a frame. Now that we have the states, we can add the state machine and set up the blend state. To do that, I can drag in the timeline and set the transition from entry to start and change its type from the right panel from a single timeline to a 1D blend like this. Or you can right click on the state machine and add a blend state as well. Now that we have the blend state, let's go ahead and add a number input to control the blend value. That is, I can name it progress to control the progress of the stroke. I can select the blend state and use the number input. Next, I can add the timelines, the states we want to create a blend in between and control with our input. I can click on the plus icon from the timelines panel and select the states, that is the start and the end. The order does not matter, but the value beside the timelines, the states matter. That is, if we want the stroke to be at the start, when our number input is 0, we can have that. If we want the stroke to be at the end, when the progress is say 100, we can have that as well. We simply have to enter the number, that is, when the input is 100, it should be the end timeline. And we get the blend in between. So if I go ahead and start the state machine and increase the progress value, notice how we blend the two states as if we are interpolating between the two like this. And if you want, you can use any other range as well. Instead of starting from 0, you can start from 20, you can start from 25, and so on. Instead of 100 as the ending value, you can use just 1, you can use 10, you can use 50, and so on. just enter the values. And if you want, you can add other states as well and create blends in between and control with the number input. Let's go ahead and add a animation after the value reaches 100%. Maybe this shape becomes a tick mark. I can add a new timeline and simply animate the position of the vertices. I can open the vertice editor. It has 3 points, which I added before. I can key in the position and then change this to a tick mark. And if I want, I can change the color as well. That is, I can key in the stroke color from selected colors and change it to a green color like this. Then I can change the interpolation of the keyframes and have something like this. Let's go ahead and use the animation in our state machine. After the value has reached 100 or above that, we can transition to the done animation from the blend state. The same thing as we have done before. We create a transition from blend to the done and then set up the condition that is our number input should be greater than or equal to 100. I can set that operation and set the value as well we want to compare against. Now, if I go ahead and start the state machine, increase the value, we perform the blend, and then if it goes above 100 or becomes equal to 100, we have the done animation. And that's how we use blend states in state machine. With blend states, I've gone ahead and set up an interaction like this. I have created 2 states, keying in the rotation of the dial group and the trim end of the strokes at the start and the end, and then created the blend in between with blend state and controlled with a number input. Now, as the number goes up, I want the dial to start wriggling a bit like this. To achieve that, we can mix an animation of the dial rotating with blend additive states. First of all, I can create an animation of the dial rotating like this, and we have to apply that to a different object because the dial group is already animated. Its rotation is keyed in at the start and the end timeline and used in the 1D blend, that is to move the dial like this. We want to add the wriggle on top, so it will be a different object or a different point of transformation, if you will. To do that, I can simply group the objects inside, that is create a new group and change its rotation. So first of all, I can change its origin and then change its rotation, animate that. Let's add a new timeline. I will name it dial wriggle and then key in the new group as well. Let's name it wriggle control, and then I can key in the rotation value. Let's say to -3 and 3 we will animate in between, something like this. To do that, and set the timeline duration to 10 and the playback mode to ping pong and have the animation. If you want, you can apply easing to the keyframes and set the playback speed say to 2x and have something like this. Now that we have the animation, we can apply the wriggle on top of the 1D blend, that is in a new layer. I can go ahead and first of all add the timeline, and then I can change its type as well from a single timeline to blend additive, and then add the same timeline by clicking on the plus icon and mix by a state machine input. If you want, you can mix that with a static value or a view model property. In this case, we can use state machine input. Then I can select the same timeline and then our state machine number input. Now I can go ahead and control the mix value of the animation with the number input. So if I start the animation at the start, it won't animate. But if I go ahead and change its rotation like this, it will start to rotate. At the start of the state machine, we have this offset because I've changed the initial rotation of the inner group to -10. I'll set that to 0 and it will fix the same. Getting back to our blend additive animation, if I go ahead and increase the number input, it will start blending the animation as well by a bit. If I increase the value more, it will increase the mix value as well. And if I set it to 100, it will mix the animation by 100% as well. That's how we use the blend additive state. If we want, we can create another animation to wriggle the strokes as well, the custom shape. So I can go ahead and create a duplicate of the dial wriggle, call it the shake of the background shape. I can go ahead and remove the existing keyframes, select the background shape, and simply move it up and down by a pixel like this. And then I can go ahead and do the same thing that is in the blend additive state. I can add another mix control by input, select the timeline, and then select the input as well to control the mix value. And that's how we use blend additive in state machines. In this one, we will learn how to set up our listeners. Here, I have a simple state machine setup to switch between the idle and the hovered state using a Boolean input. What if we want to perform the same thing by hovering over the element itself, the rectangle in this case? To do that, we can set up a listener. From the listeners panel, I can add a new listener and call it hover in, and then I can select a target on which we want to set up the listener. That will be the top rectangle in this case. And then I can select the event as well we want to listen for. That will be pointer enter, the default one, the pointer entering the target shape, the top rectangle in this case, that is hovering in. When that happens, we can perform an action which we can specify from the bottom panel. I can remove the default action and instead add a new one by clicking on the plus icon and selecting input change. We can change the input that is set the is hovered Boolean input to true when we enter the target shape with our pointer. I can start the state machine, and now if I hover over the target shape, the Boolean is checked. Now I can do the same thing for the hover out as well. That is, I can add another listener, call it hover out, select the target, same as before, and then change the event we are listening for. Instead of pointer enter, we want to listen for pointer exit, us exiting the target shape with the pointer, that is hovering out. I can set the action as well, that is input change. We can set is hovered to false this time. Now I can go ahead and hover in and out of the shape like this and get the state changes as well. Here's another example. I can control its idle and hovered state as well with listeners. First of all, we add a listener. We can give it a name, and then we select the target shape on which we want to listen for the events, and then we set a action from the bottom panel, that is state machine input change. I can select the input and set the value that will be true, and then I can add another listener for the hover out as well by simply duplicating this listener, changing its name, and then I can change the event we're listening for, that will be pointer exit, and then I can change the action as well, setting the input to false this time. Let's restart the state machine, and then if I hover over the element, we get the state change. That's how we set up hover listeners in state machines. In this one, we will learn how to register a click listener. For that, I've set up a simple state machine controlled by a trigger input. If I trigger the input, we play the press animation. Let's do the same thing by clicking on the button itself, that is the rectangle. To do that, I can add a new listener, call it click, and then set the target shape. That will be the top rectangle. And then I can select the event we want to listen for. That will be click in this case. Then I can set the action to perform when the click happens. That will be firing the clicked trigger input. I can start the state machine, and then if I click on the target shape, we have the trigger of the input and the animation gets played. One thing to note here is the click listener makes sure the click happens at the same place, that is the click down and up, that is pressing and releasing the mouse button. if I press the mouse button, then move away the cursor, and then release the mouse button, then the click is not registered. So the click down and up should happen at the same place. Instead, if you want, you can set up listeners to listen for click down and click up separately as well. Let's go ahead and do that. I can remove the current listener and the trigger input as well. Instead, we can use a Boolean input to control the pressed state. I can change the condition. That is, if the Boolean input is true, we transition to the pressed state. If the Boolean input is set to false, we can go back to the idle state. I can check that as well. Then I can set up the listeners and I can select the element as well, that is the target shape, first of all. And then if I add a listener, that will be used as a target. So first of all, we can set up a listener for pointer down, that is pressing the mouse button. I can set the action as well. That will be setting the is pressed Boolean input to true. And then I can add another listener for pointer up, that is releasing the mouse button, change the event to pointer up, and change the action as well, setting the Boolean input to false in this case. Now I can play the state machine. I can click down on the target shape. It will check the Boolean input. If I release the mouse button, then it will uncheck the Boolean input. And that's how we can set up click listeners in state machine. In this one, we will learn how to set up a listener to follow the position of the cursor, that is the pointer. Say we want to follow the position of the pointer with this control and move it around by hovering over like this. To do that, we can set up a listener. And for the target shape of the listener, we need a shape inside of which we can move around. Right now, we don't have any shape like that. So I can add a rectangle and define the hover area. That is, I can set the size of this rectangle to that of the artboard or have a custom size like this. And then I can use it as the target shape. For the listener, I can remove the fill or set that to 10% for demonstration, change its name to hover area and lock the layer as well. So I can select the things behind. Then I can set that as the target shape for the listener. And for the event to listen for the pointer position, we can use the pointer move like this. For the action, what we want to do is move the control to that of the pointer, that is the position. And for that, we can use the align target action. I can set the target and it will align it with the position of the pointer. I can start the state machine, and then if I move inside of the target shape, notice the control moves to that position and follows the cursor as well. If I move outside of the target shape, it will stop following the position. So you can define the hover area, that is a rectangle like this, and set the bounds for the listener as well. Right now, we have a jump in the position of the control if we hover in from another position like this. Instead, we can add another target and transform constraint. That is, first of all, I can duplicate the control with the ellipse inside and then change its name to pointer control and align that to that of the pointer's position, first of all. So we are only moving that like this. Then I can remove the ellipse inside of the pointer control and set a transform constraint from the original control to that of the pointer control. And then what we can do is simply animate the strength value. If we hover inside of the hover area, we can animate the strength to 100%. If we hover out of the target shape, we can animate the strength back to 0%. So we don't have that jump. I can do that. That is create two states, timelines, keying in the strength value. Let's say follow. And in that, I can key in the strength to 100%. And then I can create another timeline. I can call it unfollow and set the strength to 0%. Then in the state machine, I can set up a simple transition that is controlled with a Boolean input. Let's call it is hovered. and then I can go ahead and add a new state machine layer and perform the transition there as well between follow and unfollow. By default, we won't follow the pointer control and we'll go to follow if we have hovered over the same, that is the shape, that is the target shape. I can select the transition. I can reframe these as well into the view, then select the transition, add the condition. If the Boolean input is set to true, we perform the transition and go back if we have hovered out as well. And then I can set up listeners for that as well. So this one is for the pointer move. Then I can add another listener with the hover area as the target. To set the hover in listener, I can set the event, and then for the action, we can set the Boolean input to true, and then I can duplicate the hover in listener, create the hover out, set the event to pointer exit, and set the Boolean input to false for the action. Now I can test the same out with some transition duration in between. I can move the pointer inside the hover area, and then if I move out, we have it fall back to its original position because the strength value is animated. I can view that as well. That is, I can open the transform constraint property, and then if I hover in, notice it animates to 100%. If I hover out, it goes back to 0%. So that's how we create a pointer follow effect in Rive. If you have enjoyed the video this far, please drop a like below and subscribe for future updates. You can also comment below suggesting topics you'd like to be covered in the future videos. And also do check out the full Rive animation course. And that's all for this time.